October 24, 1944. Dawn breaks over the Philippine Sea. The horizon glows pale amber, stretched thin between water and sky. A Japanese reconnaissance pilot leans forward in his cockpit, squinting through salt-crusted goggles as his Yokosuka D-4Y Judy drones eastward at 8,000 feet. The engine's monotone hum blends with the whisper of wind against aluminum skin. Below, the sea lies flat and indifferent, a gray mirror catching the first light. He is searching for the American fleet, the same fleet his superiors assured him would be fragmented, depleted, bleeding from 2 years of island warfare. He checks his fuel gauge with a gloved hand, calculates the minutes until he must turn back. And then he sees them. Not one carrier, not two, 8 flat-tops spread across the water like a steel archipelago, their wakes carving white scars into the Pacific. Each one larger than anything he has studied in silhouette charts. Each one surrounded by cruisers, destroyers, supply vessels, a floating city of war. His breath catches. His hand trembles as he keys the radio, voice tight, reporting what should be impossible. 8 carriers, simultaneously, in a single task force. The numbers don't align with what he learned at Itajima Naval Academy, where instructors mocked American shipbuilding as slow, wasteful, obsessed with creature comforts over combat efficiency. He had believed them. They all had. But here, beneath the rising sun, the impossible floats, and he understands, in the cold clarity of that cockpit, that everything he was taught about American weakness is a lie. To understand this moment, to grasp why 8 carriers appearing together shattered not just tactical expectations, but ideological certainty, we must return to the years before, when Japan's naval aviators stood atop the world and looked down at their American counterparts with something close to pity. In 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed the finest carrier doctrine on Earth. The Kido Butai, the first air fleet, had perfected coordinated multi-carrier operations through relentless drilling and combat experience in China. Japanese pilots trained for years, not months. Their Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters outclassed every opponent in range, maneuverability, and climb rate. At Pearl Harbor, 6 Japanese carriers launched a strike so precise it crippled the American Pacific Fleet in under 2 hours. At Ceylon in the Indian Ocean, they sank British heavy cruisers and a carrier with clinical efficiency. Japanese naval aviation wasn't just superior, it was an art form, a religion, a birthright earned through Bushido and brutal selection. American carriers, by contrast, seemed laughable. Japanese intelligence officers studied reconnaissance photographs and design schematics with barely concealed contempt. The USS Lexington and Saratoga, converted battlecruisers, were massive and slow, their hulls bloated with unnecessary spaces. American carriers featured amenities that baffled Japanese designers: ice cream machines, soda fountains, air-conditioned berthing compartments, laundries, even libraries. One Japanese naval architect, reviewing captured documents after the Battle of Midway, noted with derision that American carriers allocated more cubic feet to crew comfort than to ammunition storage. The report circulated through Combined Fleet headquarters, reinforcing a narrative. Americans were soft, industrialized but not disciplined, capable of building quantity but never quality. This contempt had roots deeper than engineering. It was cultural, spiritual. The Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan, emphasized purity through sacrifice, strength through deprivation. Japanese carriers like the Shokaku and Zuikaku were lean, efficient, beautiful in their austerity. Crews slept in cramped quarters, ate simple rice and pickles, endured because endurance itself was virtue. American sailors, the thinking went, needed luxury to fight. They were merchants in uniform, not warriors. Their carriers were floating hotels, not instruments of divine wind. Japanese pilots absorbed this worldview. In ready rooms aboard the Akagi and Kaga, they joked about American flight decks cluttered with unnecessary equipment, about pilots who couldn't function without coffee and hot meals. They had seen American carrier designs, the Essex-class blueprints, leaked through intelligence networks, and laughed at the redundant systems, the excessive armor, the sheer wastefulness of dedicating space to crew recreation. Why would a warrior need a movie theater? Why install elaborate firefighting systems when a disciplined crew could control blazes through courage alone? The early battles seemed to confirm Japanese superiority. At Coral Sea in May 1942, both sides lost a carrier, but Japan could afford the trade, or so they believed. At Midway, the loss of 4 carriers shocked the empire. Yet even in defeat, Japanese pilots maintained their sense of qualitative edge. They blamed faulty intelligence, bad luck, American desperation, not systemic inferiority. The Zero was still the world's best fighter. Japanese pilots still trained longer, flew better. America had numbers, yes, but numbers without spirit meant nothing, except the numbers kept growing. By mid-1943, Japanese commanders began receiving reports that didn't fit their models. American carrier production was accelerating beyond projections. Intelligence estimated the United States might launch 8 or 10 Essex-class carriers by 1944. Then the estimates revised upward, 12, 15. The numbers seemed fantastical, propaganda meant to demoralize. Japan's shipyards, even working around the clock, could barely replace losses. The Tai-Ho, their newest fleet carrier, took 3 years to complete and incorporated lessons from every previous design. It was a masterpiece, one masterpiece. America was allegedly launching a new carrier every 6 weeks. Japanese naval staff officers, trained in the patient calculus of attrition warfare, ran the numbers again. They checked industrial capacity reports, steel production figures, shipyard expansion data. The math was impossible. No nation could build that fast without sacrificing quality. These new American carriers, they reasoned, must be inferior, lightly armored, poorly equipped, rushed into service with green crews. Quantity over quality, the eternal American failing. The reports were filed with annotations noting the expected weaknesses, untrained pilots, mechanical failures, logistical chaos. But the pilots flying combat patrols started reporting something else. They encountered American carrier aircraft in growing numbers, and these planes weren't flown by amateurs. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, which began appearing in late 1943, wasn't just numerous, it was good, better than good. It climbed nearly as fast as the Zero, dove faster, and could absorb damage that would shred a Japanese fighter. American pilots, supposedly inferior, fought with aggressive confidence, using tactics that leveraged their aircraft's strengths. And behind every engagement, intelligence officers detected the presence of more carriers, more air groups, more of everything. The symbolic object that began to haunt Japanese naval consciousness wasn't a weapon, it was ice cream. Captured American aircrew, interrogated after being shot down, spoke casually about shipboard life. They described meals with multiple courses, fresh bread, cold milk. They mentioned ice cream served daily in carrier mess halls, a luxury so absurd to their captors that interrogators initially dismissed it as propaganda or delusion. But the accounts persisted. Every captured American aviator mentioned food, abundant, varied, prepared in galleys with electric ovens and refrigeration. Japanese pilots, subsisting on diminishing rations of rice, dried fish, and wilted vegetables, heard these accounts secondhand and felt something shift. Not envy, exactly, unease. Ice cream became a joke, then a symbol, then a whisper of doubt. If America could afford to make ice cream on a warship in the middle of combat operations, what else could they afford? How deep were their reserves? How vast their industrial capacity? The joke stopped being funny. It became a ghost in the ready room, a cold presence reminding them that abundance, stupid, wasteful American abundance, might matter more than spirit. Still, doctrine held. Quality over quantity, Bushido over materialism. The decisive battle was coming, the Kantai-Kessen, where Japan's remaining carriers would meet America's fleet and superior training would prevail. Japanese naval strategy had always envisioned this, a single, apocalyptic engagement where skill and sacrifice would overcome industrial might. They needed only to preserve their strength, choose the moment, and strike with the precision that had won them the Pacific in 1941. Then came the Marianas. June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. A battle the Americans would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, though that name would take time to reach Japanese ears, filtered through the fog of catastrophic loss. Japan committed 9 carriers to the battle, everything they had left. The plan was elegant: launch strikes from maximum range, beyond where American fighters could intercept, then recover aircraft at Guam's airfields while the carriers withdrew. Use land bases and carrier strength together, multiplying force. Admiral Ozawa believed he had the advantage. American carriers were clumsy, their doctrine defensive, their pilots adequate, but uninspired. Japanese aircrew would exploit range and maneuverability, the traditional strengths. The first strike wave launched at dawn, 69 aircraft, a spear aimed at the American fleet. They never reached their targets. American radar, a technology Japanese designers had neglected, detected the strike at 90 miles. Grumman Hellcats climbed to intercept, vectored with inhuman precision by fighter directors reading green phosphor screens. A Japanese formation, flying in the tight, parade-like order that had worked against Chinese opposition, encountered American fighters in coordinated divisions, diving from superior altitude, slashing through bomber formations before the Zeros could react. The Americans didn't dogfight. They attacked in pairs, one engaging while the other covered, using speed and firepower to negate the Zeros' agility. Japanese pilots, trained in individual aerial combat as a form of personal honor, found themselves targeted by a system, not warriors. Hellcats dove, fired, climbed away before Zeros could turn. Within minutes, the first strike wave disintegrated. 42 Japanese aircraft fell into the sea. The survivors, disoriented, scattered. 3 more strike waves followed that day. Each time, American radar saw them coming. Each time, Hellcats climbed to meet them. By evening, Japan had lost 350 aircraft and 2 carriers to submarine attacks. The Americans lost 29 planes. It wasn't a battle. It was an industrial process, steel and coordination grinding spirit into the ocean. But the full horror didn't reach Tokyo immediately. Reports were sanitized, losses minimized. Japanese newspapers reported a great victory in the Philippine Sea, with American carriers sunk and invasions thwarted. Pilots who survived, broken, traumatized, were quietly rotated to training commands or ground assignments where their accounts wouldn't spread. The high command needed the myth intact, needed to believe that the next engagement, the true decisive battle, would restore the balance. Japanese aviators still flying combat missions knew better. They saw the empty bunks, the depleted squadrons, the replacement pilots arriving with barely 100 flight hours. They flew patrols over the Philippines and counted American ships on the horizon. Cruisers, battleships, destroyer screens extending to the edge of vision. And carriers. Always more carriers. One patrol would report
3 flattops. The next would find 5. Intelligence collated the sightings and produced estimates that seemed deranged. 12, 15, perhaps 18 American carriers now operating in the Western Pacific. But even those estimates, inflated as they seemed, were conservative. Because America hadn't just built carriers, they had built a system. The Essex-class carrier program represented something unprecedented in naval history: mass production of capital warships. Traditional naval architecture treated each battleship or carrier as a unique creation, designed slowly, built carefully, commissioned with ceremony. The Essex-class inverted that model. They were modular, standardized, designed for rapid construction using prefabricated sections. Shipyards from Newport News to Philadelphia to San Francisco worked from identical blueprints, sharing techniques, competing on speed. But speed didn't mean shoddiness. Each Essex-class carrier displaced 27,000 tons, carried 90 aircraft, could sustain 33 knots, and incorporated armor and damage control systems beyond anything the Japanese fielded. They had redundant electrical systems, multiple backup generators, sophisticated fire suppression networks, and compartmentalization that allowed them to absorb torpedo and kamikaze hits that would sink a Japanese carrier. The wasteful design features Japanese engineers mocked, the excessive crew spaces, the redundant systems, the overbuilt structures, were deliberate. American naval architects designed for survival, for sustained operations far from home ports, for crews who needed to fight for months without rest. And the ice cream machines weren't frivolous. They were psychological warfare. American carriers carried frozen food stores that allowed varied meals for months. They had bakeries producing fresh bread, galleys serving hot meals around the clock to accommodate flight operations at any hour. Pilots returning from combat missions could shower, eat a steak, sleep in a bunk with a real mattress, and wake to coffee and eggs. This wasn't luxury, it was operational readiness. Rested, well-fed crews performed better, made fewer mistakes, sustained morale through the grinding months of Pacific campaigning. The ice cream machine represented something deeper, proof that America's industrial base was so vast, so unconstrained, that they could afford to care for their warriors as humans, not expendable tools. Japanese carriers, by contrast, operated on the edge.
Logistical collapse. Food supplies dwindled. Replacement parts never arrived. Fuel was rationed. Pilots flew knowing there were no reserves, no reinforcements, no margin for error. The spiritual strength they had cultivated, the pride and endurance, became a trap. They endured because they had no choice, and the endurance slowly hollowed them out. By October 1944, Japan's naval strategy balanced on desperation's edge. The Philippines had to be held. If America captured the islands, supply lines to the Dutch East Indies, Japan's last source of oil, would be severed. The empire would suffocate. So Admiral Toyota devised Sho-Go, the Victory Plan, a complex operation using every remaining warship in a coordinated gamble. Carriers would act as decoys, drawing American attention north, while battleships slipped through San Bernardino Strait to annihilate invasion forces at Leyte Gulf. It was a plan born of necessity, sacrifice, and mathematical certainty that Japan had nothing left to lose. The carriers chosen as bait, Zuikaku, Chitose, Chiyoda, Zuiho, sailed nearly empty. Japan had aircraft, but no pilots to fly them. The Marianas had devoured the trained aircrew. Replacements were teenagers with 50 hours of flight time, barely capable of landing on a deck in calm seas, useless in combat. So the carriers sailed with skeleton air groups, their purpose reduced to a single function: be seen, draw Halsey's Third Fleet north, let the battleships do the real work. On October 24, as the Japanese Northern Force steamed south, that reconnaissance pilot spotted what no one expected. Not 3 or 4 American carriers, 8, simultaneously, in visual range of each other. The pilot's report reached Admiral Ozawa aboard the Zuikaku just after noon. He read it twice, checked the coordinates, requested confirmation. 8 carriers. The confirmation came, 8 confirmed, possibly more beyond radar range. Ozawa felt the plan disintegrate in his hands. They had expected to lure away 3 or 4 carriers, maybe 5. Halsey's entire striking power concentrated. But 8? That meant there were more to the south, guarding the invasion beaches. That meant American carrier strength had exceeded every estimate, every projection. That meant the war was already over.
Even if no one in Tokyo would admit it. Japanese aviators, briefed for the decoy mission, understood they were flying to their deaths. The mission was explicit: launch what few planes they had, attack the American fleet, make enough noise to draw Halsey north. Don't worry about returning. The carriers wouldn't survive anyway. Some pilots prayed, others wrote final letters, tucked them in footlockers they knew would sync with the ships. A few felt relief. The waiting was over. Better to die in combat than waste away as the empire crumbled. They launched in the early morning of October 25, 76 aircraft total, less than a single American carrier's complement. They flew south toward the reported position, spread thin, knowing they would face hundreds of Hellcats. The American Combat Air Patrol intercepted them 60 miles out. The battle lasted 12 minutes. 33 Japanese aircraft fell. The survivors scattered, jettisoning ordnance, fleeing west toward land bases that had already been bombed into rubble. A few made it, most didn't. But the decoy worked. Halsey took the bait, charging north with every carrier he had, leaving San Bernardino Strait unguarded. For a few hours, the plan seemed brilliant. Japanese battleships raced through the strait, their guns aimed at the vulnerable invasion force. Then they encountered Taffy 3, a group of 6 escort carriers, smaller and slower than fleet carriers, protected by a handful of destroyers. The escort carriers shouldn't have survived. Their aircraft were configured for ground support, not naval combat. Their escorts were outgunned by factors of 10. But the escort carriers had something else: abundance. They launched every plane they had, arming them with whatever ordnance was available: bombs meant for land targets, depth charges, rockets. Pilots made strafing runs with empty guns, simulating attacks to force Japanese battleships into evasive maneuvers. Destroyers charged battleships, firing torpedoes at suicidal range, buying time. And the carriers radioed for help. Help came. Not from Halsey. He was 200 miles north, chasing Ozawa's decoy force. Help came from other escort carrier groups, from land-based aircraft, from the sheer redundancy of American naval power. Within hours, strike from multiple directions overwhelmed Japanese targeting. The battleships, damaged and confused, retreated. The invasion force survived. To the north, Halsey's carriers annihilated Ozawa's decoys. All 4 Japanese carriers sank, along with their escorts. American losses? 0 carriers. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ended with Japan's navy effectively destroyed. They had sunk 1 American escort carrier, damaged others. But they had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The mathematics were final.
What the reconnaissance pilots saw that October morning wasn't just 8 carriers. It was the death of an ideology. Japanese naval doctrine had rested on the assumption that quality, of design, of training, of spirit, would triumph over industrial quantity. That a warrior culture, forged through sacrifice, would overcome a merchant culture bloated with comfort. This wasn't merely military strategy, it was theological. The Yamato race, they believed, possessed innate superiority that no amount of American steel could match. The 8 carriers shattered that theology. Not because American pilots were better. Many Japanese aviators still held technical edges in certain maneuvers. Not because American carriers were individually superior. The Zukaku, even in her death throes, was a magnificent ship. The 8 carriers proved that abundance itself was a weapon. That a nation capable of building a fleet carrier every 6 weeks, equipping it with 90 aircraft, staffing it with trained crews, supplying it with fuel and food and ammunition, and yes, ice cream. That nation had transcended the old calculations of warfare. American carrier design, mocked for its wastefulness, revealed itself as ruthlessly efficient. The crew comforts weren't luxuries, they were force multipliers. A rested pilot flew better missions. A well-fed crew fought harder fires. Redundant systems meant ships survived to fight again. The Essex-class carriers absorbed damage at places like Santa Cruz and Bunker Hill that would have sunk any Japanese flat-top, then returned to combat within weeks. They were designed not for individual glory, but for sustained industrial warfare. And in that contest, spirit alone couldn't compete. The ice cream machine, that absurd symbol, represented the fundamental asymmetry. Japan built beautiful carriers with crews trained to endure deprivation.
America built functional carriers with crews trained to expect support. Japan's carriers were artworks, irreplaceable. America's were products, renewable. When a Japanese pilot died, years of training vanished. When an American pilot died, another graduated from Pensacola 2 weeks later. It wasn't that individual Americans were better. It was that the system could absorb losses, adapt, replace, and overwhelm through sheer material persistence. Japanese aviators, the survivors, the ones who lived through Leyte and Iwo Jima and Okinawa, carried this knowledge like a wound. In post-war accounts, many spoke not of tactical defeats, but of psychological ones. The moment they saw the American fleet, not 3 or 4 carriers, but 8, 10, 12, sailing together with supply trains longer than Japanese battle lines, launching strikes around the clock, replacing losses overnight. That was the moment they knew. The emperor might not surrender for another year, kamikazes might continue flying, but the war was finished. One pilot, Saburo Sakai, among Japan's leading aces, wrote decades later about the day he flew reconnaissance over an American task force and counted 15 carriers in visual range, not spread across the Pacific, concentrated, right there. He had descended to verify, risking anti-aircraft fire, because he couldn't believe what he was seeing. 15 flat tops, their decks crowded with aircraft, their wakes merging into a single vast disturbance that turned the ocean white. He flew back in silence, landed, filed his report. That night, alone, he wept. Not from fear, from understanding. The symbolism of the 8 carriers extended beyond military history into the post-war narrative both nations constructed. For America, Leyte Gulf became proof that democracy's industrial model, decentralized production, standardized components, systems designed for scale, could outperform authoritarian efficiency. The carriers weren't just weapons, they were arguments. They demonstrated that a free society, with workers choosing their employers, unions negotiating wages, factories competing for contracts, could outproduce a militarized economy where the state commanded every resource. For Japan, the 8 carriers marked the end of the Bushido fantasy. The belief that spiritual strength, racial purity, and warrior culture could compensate for material disadvantage collapsed under the weight of American steel. Post-war Japanese society, rebuilding from ashes, absorbed different lesson, that prosperity and strength came not from sacrifice, but from production, not from purity, but from pragmatism. The ice cream machine, in this reading, became a model,
not an indulgence, but an investment in human capital. Proof that caring for people produced better outcomes than demanding their suffering. Both narratives simplify, of course. War is never clean allegory. American carrier crews suffered nightmares and trauma no ice cream could cure. Japanese pilots died with courage that transcended ideology. But the image persists. 8 carriers appearing simultaneously, an impossibility made real, representing the moment when abundance defeated austerity, when industrial democracy outproduced imperial discipline, when the math of mass production rewrote the calculus of naval warfare. In the decades after, as Japan rose again, not through military conquest but through industrial mastery, there was a strange echo. Japanese factories adopted American mass production techniques, improved them, and exported cars and electronics that flooded global markets. The mentality shift from Bushido sacrifice to efficient abundance, from spiritual purity to material pragmatism, traced back to that moment on October 24, 1944, when a reconnaissance pilot looked down and saw what his training said couldn't exist. The carriers are gone now, most of them, scrapped in the 1970s, their steel recycled. The Lexington survives as a museum in Corpus Christi, her flight deck empty, her hangar bays echoing. Visitors walk her corridors and see the ice cream machine, preserved behind plexiglass, a relic that seems quaint until you understand what it represented. Not luxury, power. The power to care for your people even in the midst of apocalypse. The power to say, we are so strong, so secure in our abundance, that we can afford this small comfort. And if we can afford this, imagine what else we can bring to bear. October 24, 1944. The reconnaissance pilot, fuel gauge dipping toward reserve, turns his duty northward for the long flight home. Below, the 8 carriers steam in formation, their Hellcats circling overhead, their task groups screening the sea. He does not know.
He is witnessing the future, that these ships will survive the war, that American carriers will dominate every ocean for the next 80 years, that the doctrine they represent will become the template for naval aviation worldwide. He knows only that he must report what he saw, though the words feel impossible even as he keys the radio. 8 carriers, simultaneously. In the ready room of the Zuikaku, pilots listen to the report in silence. Some shake their heads, believing it an error. Others stare at the bulkhead, calculating. A few stand and walk out, needing air, needing to be away from the numbers that don't add up, that render all their training and sacrifice irrelevant. One pilot, 22 years old, trained since he was 16, approaches the intelligence officer and asks a question that breaks protocol. How many carriers do they have in total? The intelligence officer hesitates, consults a folder, looks up, and his face is the face of a man reading an execution order. We estimate, he says slowly, between 27 and 30 fleet and escort carriers operational in the Pacific Theater, with 9 more completing construction in American shipyards. The pilot nods, thanks him, walks to his bunk and sits, staring at his hands. He is an excellent aviator. He has 78 carrier landings, 16 confirmed kills, a commendation for bravery at Eastern Solomons. He knows how to lead a strike, how to dive through flak, how to find a carrier's deck in bad weather. He knows everything except how to fight 30 carriers with the 4 they have left. Outside, the Philippine sun climbs toward noon. The sea glitters. Somewhere to the south, American carriers are launching aircraft for another strike, their flight decks alive with organized chaos, planes spotted, ordnance loaded, catapults firing in rhythmic sequence. In the galleys below, cooks prepare lunch for thousands, ice cream machines churn, coffee brews. The machinery of abundance, vast and unstoppable, grinds forward. And in that moment, the war's outcome is written not in courage or cowardice, not in tactical brilliance or strategic blunder, but in the simple, overwhelming fact of industrial capacity. 8 carriers where there should be 3, 30 carriers where there should be 10. An endless stream of aircraft, of pilots, of ordnance, of food, of everything that sustained humans pushed to their limit. The Japanese pilot sits in his bunk and understands what his commanders do not yet admit. They are fighting not a nation, but a system, not an enemy, but an idea. The idea that prosperity and strength are compatible, that caring for warriors doesn't weaken them, that abundance is not decadence, but discipline of a different kind. It is an idea his culture has no answer for, because every answer they have crafted, endurance, sacrifice, purity, spirit, assumes scarcity, assumes that strength comes from suffering. But the Americans have proved otherwise. They have built a fleet on the assumption that suffering is inefficient, that comfortable sailors fight harder, that steel and food, and yes, even ice cream, matter more than stoic deprivation. And they are winning. Not because their pilots are better, though many are, but because when an American pilot dies, another takes his place tomorrow. When a carrier sinks, 3 more are launched next month. The pipeline is infinite, the reserves bottomless. It is a kind of warfare the samurai tradition never imagined, and against it, Bushido is meaningless. The great truth of Leyte Gulf, the lesson written in the Pacific's indifferent waters, is that ideology crumbles before logistics, that romanticism, however beautiful, loses to pragmatism, that a nation organized around abundance can defeat a nation organized around scarcity, not because abundance is morally superior, but because it is materially unstoppable. The 8 carriers were a message, though not intentionally. They were simply the reality of American production applied to war, efficient, redundant, overwhelming. They appeared simultaneously not to intimidate, but because that's what the schedule demanded, because the shipyards had finished them, because the crews were trained, because the system worked. And in appearing, they ended an era, the era when naval warfare was an art, when individual ships bore names and reputations, when battles turned on the skill of a single
pilot or the courage of a lone captain. The 8 carriers inaugurated a new age, industrial warfare, where victory belonged to the nation that could mobilize resources faster, sustain operations longer, replace losses quicker. It was an age Japan could not compete in because their entire culture had been built on the opposite premise. The reconnaissance pilot lands, reports, and is thanked. He does not fly again. The war ends 10 months later, and he returns to a Japan that no longer exists. Not physically, the cities are rubble, but conceptually. The Japan of Bushido and sacrifice and spiritual purity has been incinerated, replaced by something American occupation will shape, but not wholly create. A Japan of production, of efficiency, of abundance sought not through conquest, but through trade. Years later, he will stand in a Toyota factory in Nagoya and watch cars roll off an assembly line, 1 every 90 seconds, and he will remember the 8 carriers. The lesson has been learned. Not because they surrendered. Surrender was just acknowledgement. The lesson was learned on October 24, 1944, when he saw what abundance looked like when organized for war, when he understood that no amount of courage could bridge the gap between 4 carriers and 30. The ice cream machine endures as symbol because it distills that truth to its essence. It says, we are so powerful we can afford to be kind, so rich we can invest in comfort, so confident that we waste nothing on austerity. And that confidence, that abundance, is the weapon, not the ice cream itself, the worldview it represents. The idea that strength comes not from suffering, but from systems, not from spirit alone, but from spirit supported by steel and food and rest, and yes, cold sweetness after a mission flown, a battle survived, a day endured on the edge of death. The carriers are gone, but the lesson remains, carved into history, floating in memory. 8 flat tops appearing where there should be 3, and in that moment of impossible plenty, the future is decided. Dawn over the Philippine Sea, the reconnaissance pilot, turning for home. The 8 carriers steaming south, their wakes white against gray water, their decks pregnant with aircraft, their hulls solid with American certainty. And below, in the galleys, in the spaces Japanese designers would have considered wasted, the ice cream machines churn on, indifferent and eternal, producing small comfort in the vast machinery of war. That is the image that endures, not because it is romantic, but because it is true. And truth, in the end, weighs more than courage, endures longer than sacrifice, floats heavier than steel. 8 carriers, simultaneously, the death of one world, the birth of another, both written in the same moment, on the same sea, under the same indifferent sun.